Also, archivists have a great need for digital libraries, and as I've basically talked about throughout the whole course, because I am an archivist myself, so it's the bias that I have when I think about digital libraries, but they have a huge need for them. They want to share their collections, display documents and oral histories, all sorts of materials that they hold. Not only create better access, but also preserve fragile materials. If you digitize it once and put it up on the web in a digital library, it's you're more apt to prevent damage from overhandling. All sorts of people have access to it that may not be able to travel to your repository. There's all sorts of good when you digitize something in that regard. And then not only that, but there's also rare or valuable items that can be viewed with greater ease. Ones that most archives or special collections have a vault, so often there needs to be special arrangements set up if it's a really valuable item. Sometimes they might have things like scrolls that are not only fragile but just really awkward to display and for someone to say come into your reading room and view. So if you digitize it once, it's just so much easier. Typically, I'd say 90% of the time, just seeing the digitized version is much easier and sometimes even better because they want to take it home with them, so to speak. So they want to be able to download it. If it's a video, for example, they might want to edit it and use it for a project. So there's all sorts of good there, especially for archivists. Educators, again, K through 12 and higher education have a need for digital libraries. Trying to build inquiry-based tasks for students, create lesson plans. That would be for a K to 12, K through 12 educator. Often, assets that you might put in a digital library could be used as like primary sources to, for a teaching assignment. You can build learning modules with your team. There's all sorts of things that educators can do with digital libraries that typically are more hands-on oriented. Special interests or enthusiasts, they might use a digital library to create sort of like a family tree about their genealogy, or it might be some sort of pet project they're interested in. It's not their vocation but more their advocation, where they're interested in old coins or nature related things or sports, you name it. Digital libraries can be used in that realm as well. So what assets do you own? And I think that is a good question to ask when you're looking at a repository software, because some of them, they all seem to do one thing better than the other. There is no one system that does everything really well. By the same token, there's none, I would say, that are just across the board awful. I mean, they always tend to have a certain audience in mind or a use in mind, and then they tend to build the repository architecture toward that. So do you have photographs? Well, one of the digital repository we use here at SUNY is called Luna, and it was built by Getty. The Getty Institute is a very rich, wealthy, I think, nonprofit sort of library, art history institute in California, and the Getty developed the Luna software system, and the sort of user they had in mind when they were building it were people like art historians who have to use a lot of images. So it does images really well and still does it pretty well, even though it's an older platform. Text documents, another one we'll just briefly talk about in a few more slides, is called Content DM, and it has a very library sort of bias, if you will, and it was developed at OCLC, which is the kind of librarians think tank, if you will. I don't know how wealthy they are, but they definitely are a huge benefit to the library community, and they developed Content DM, and then later on, basically once they developed it, sold it to a private sector interest who now just runs it on its own, and it costs money and so forth, but its bias is much more towards text documents, ones that do databases. There's others that do videos really well. Audio, it tends, if it does video or movies well, it does audio as well too, because they tend to go hand in hand. Some can handle web pages. Some do newspapers really well. Content DM again does newspapers well. There's another one that was developed by the Library of Congress that handles newspapers well. Data. If you are doing a digital library that handled data, you might have a lot of like levels of restriction that you would put for using that data, like if it was sensitive. There's all sorts of sort of functionality you might need to build into that software to handle these various types of digital assets. So anyways, the assets may dictate the system you choose. Not always, but it's usually a big part of it. You might think of use cases or stakeholders. So again, types of material may dictate the software you choose. Or what are the user's expectations? Do they have, they might not expect it, but you know they will. They might need to see certain branding. And does the software allow you to brand the digital library that sort of goes smoothly and basically fits your overall branding scheme for your website and the other things that you do? Does it have mobile? So that's a big thing now, and it almost goes without saying that most modern software is being built now as mobile friendly, but it may not be, and that's something to consider. Is it worth losing all those users? Typically people who use digital libraries, they might find the digital library via mobile, but then they would switch to like a desktop computer if they're going to do a lot of long periods of searching and browsing and so forth. Do you have sensitive or restricted data or images or video of that sort, or things that are like copyright, where you really only are allowed to show that copyrighted material to like a certain audience, or maybe it's licensed material, as I talked before? Sometimes you buy a license for an ebook or for videos or whatever, and the license based on how many quote-unquote seats you have. So if it's based on the students, and say there's 17,000 students, that's the license you're paying for. So if for some reason you decide, well, I'm licensing this ebook for 17,000 seats, but I'm just going to open it up to the public, so really 4 billion people can look at it. You're going to run into issues there, and that's when you got to make sure that your software can actually lock down and restrict who has access to it. This kind of goes back to the branding a little bit, but does the software need to integrate with enterprise applications? Not only does it integrate visually, that would be something to consider, again, branding and graphical user interface, but it also might need to integrate with other enterprise applications. Like, are you running like a Windows/Outlook enterprise system? So does it need to integrate with that? Do you have a certain logon, single sign-on system where your software needs to be able to integrate that? There's other things like, is it really everyone, sort of the paid professionals that are going to be running this digital library, or does it need to be very accessible to the user? So like self-submission, where users can actually upload content, edit things. Those are things to consider when you're looking at software. What kind of features come with it? Are there add-ons? Does the software itself kind of run in more of like a plug-in type setup? So Omeka, which we're going to talk about a lot this week and basically for the rest of the course, it's a very plug-in oriented piece of software. But there are other types of software that are very plug-in oriented, like WordPress. That's more of a content management system, but people do use those as digital libraries or digital exhibit software. It's a very plug-in based software. Drupal is again another CMS type. It works on plug-in. So the modern development for like web development, web software development, and digital libraries as well, it's been really since 2005, really since Web 2.0 took off, has been very plug-in based, whereas software like, for example, Content DM and Luna, those were all built like in the 90s, and the sort of the plug-in paradigm for software development really hadn't been invented yet. So you'll see with newer software, they're very flexible, and this sort of add-ons, features, plugins, modules, so on and so forth. Themes, that's a thing that's used in WordPress a lot. Those are all part of it. And types of plugins would be like, is there a bulk uploader? I should put a loader, not uploaded. or can you use CSV files to upload like lots of metadata? You can click from here and go look at other Omeka plugins. We're going to get to look at those very in depth, but is there like a say a Google Maps plugin where it allows you to take, say you have a digital library and there's a lot of historic photos of places in, say, historic Albany, for example, and could you pin those photos that are in your library to an actual Google map? Well, that could be a plugin. What kinds of metadata standards will it facilitate? What vocabularies and authorities? What comes with it? What are ones that you can install? If it doesn't come with it, does it allow you to upload professional standards or customized ones? So, for example, Omeka comes with Dublin Core. I think it also allows for using Library of Congress authorities as well. To give another example, Luna, the digital asset management system we use here, that again I said was developed by Getty, and it has a very art historian sort of focus or bias. It also allows the art and architecture thesaurus to be installed in it. So again, that was their community, so they knew their community would want that sort of metadata capability, and thus they provided it. As I mentioned before, platforms are typically optimized for one specific purpose or user base or another. As they grow, though, that bias sometimes tends to get rounded down. Like, so for example, with Luna, not only does it do images really well, but then they started to allow video in it, audio. It does newspapers, or it has a document viewer in it. Doesn't do it that great, but it does do it, and they can say in their professional promotional literature that they can handle documents. One thing it does not handle well is institutional repository type setups where like you can't really do self submission or self uploading. It doesn't really handle like an IR does, for example, setting up in a research, like an academic university, where you have each department, for example, would have, like, your biology department would have all of its research, or art history, or math, and so on and so forth. And we don't talk about IRs that much in this course, but I just thought I would just talk about it a little bit. So here's a little continuum I set up just for the purposes of seeing sort of the kind of extremes of the digital library landscape. But I put DSpace over here to the left. It tends to be a much more utilitarian type of digital library, so it's kind of a one-size-fits-all. It does things that on the other end of the spectrum you would not allow. So it tends to allow for self-submission. It can be a curated environment, but the idea of this kind of IR software is that really the content owners, so that would be professors, faculty, research scientists, and so forth, they're the content owners. They get to decide how, when, and how, and what their content looks like in the digital library. So it's a much more hands-off, kind of autonomous system where people can kind of do what they want. But you can also set the system up to be heavily curated and very controlled and no self-submission if you wanted, but that's not really why it was built. Content DM, on the other hand, again, as I mentioned, it was developed by OCLC, so it really had the kind of librarian, archivist in mind, the professional. This is someone who makes their living, as hopefully you all will, doing some kind of information science, library science type of activity, and that's what Content DM was built for. The assumption is you're going to have people who are trained in cataloging, digital library work, digital archives, metadata creation, and so it tends to be a very highly curated environment, almost in the same way you would think of the print library or the stacks, that all those books were cataloged by professionals. You didn't just have someone say it was an anthropology book and you had someone from the anthropology department purchase the book, catalog it, and then you let them put it on the book and do all that. No, it was done by highly trained librarians, professionals. So Content DM works in that regard. So it tends to be a pretty rich user experience. no self-submission. They might have it now, but that was something they never did. And if they do, it's a recent addition. So the institutional repository, if they're calling their software that, then they're really misleading you, because that's not what it is. They do a lot of, they allow you to brand to a certain degree. But anyways, we'll talk a little bit more about that. But that's just sort of a continuum of seeing like the software landscape for digital libraries. Okay, so let's talk about DSpace a little bit. Again, I don't in the class really talk about institutional repositories. It's something I could put into it, but I felt like it kind of waters down some of the other parts of the class if I get into it too much, because it's kind of its own thing. Even though a lot of the fundamentals you learn in this course can be easily applied to an institutional repository. So DSpace is probably the most popular institutional repository out there, although bpress, which I might allude to on one other slide, is catching up with it. But DSpace was developed by MIT, and it still is today owned by them. Actually, no, I think they gave over the code to DuraSpace, but DSpace was developed at MIT, probably the most famous, technical institute in the U.S. It was designed to allow scholars to share academic research, so clearly right out of the gate they had a bias. It was for their own faculty. It's what we would call a turnkey solution. So turnkey, like basically you just start it up and go, like you're turning the key of a car. Sometimes it's known as a repository in a box. So to install it, typically there's very little configuration. This is all relatively speaking, because it's still a lot of work to install DSpace, but compared to other software packages, it's relatively easy. Open source, so it means the whole community can be involved. I have another slide on what open source is, but typically we think of open source as quote-unquote free, although I'll tell you there's really nothing totally free in society. There's always a cost involved, but we'll talk about that a little bit more. It supports all kinds of metadata. Dublin Core is the one that it's done the most, but as it's grown over time, it's supported other metadata standards. The workflows allow for levels administration, so when I talked about that self-submission thing, that's where this comes in, where you can allow different levels of administration or access to the back end of the system. It allows for self-submission by the scholar, again, the content owner sort of being the boss of their own content and not necessarily needing a professional like a librarian, for example, to intercede on their behalf. They can just upload their own content. So again, we talked about content DM being kind of on this other extreme. It's very library biased, not very good at IR functions. It's costly, but it has a lot of functionality, so in some ways it's probably a more complex system to build, and it does a lot more than DSpace does. It has a huge institutional buy-in or professional buy-in, lots of institutions using it, in part because OCLC sort of is the one who developed it, and they kind of seem to go in concert with OCLC, although Content DM, as I mentioned, is a separate company. It can be hosted or do a custom install or locally installed. It's getting older. DSpace is actually a bit newer. Content DM, I don't know when it was developed, what year exactly, but I'm saying the early 90s, definitely mid 90s, so it's an old code base. And what happens with code bases with any type of software, whether you're using Windows, Microsoft Word, a video game, whatever has software, as it gets older, what happens is lock-in sets in, and that's what has happened with Content DM. And so in order for them to keep making it a responsive and software that people want, it gets more and more costly over time to make those changes, and sometimes they make those changes and pass the cost on to the user, or sometimes they don't. They're just like, you know what, that's something we don't do, and we're not going to change our product to meet that because it's just too expensive for us. Omeka, this is the software that you're going to read about this week, and we're going to again talk about basically for the remainder of the course. it's kind of a funny name, and I like that they chose that because if you do Google searches for Omeka, it pops up almost immediately. But it's not. It's funny to me, but it's a real word. It's a Swahili word that meaning to display or lay out goods or wares, to speak out, spread out, to unpack. And I think it's a really great name that they chose because that's basically what it does. It's a digital library software platform that allows you to not only make digital libraries, but it's really good at making exhibits with your digital library assets. It lets you use Dublin Core, which we've already talked about in the course. And as I mentioned, it's a newer software platform. It's already showing its age, but relatively speaking, it's pretty new. It developed, I think, maybe around 2005, 2006. So again, it uses that sort of WordPress-like environment where it has a administrator side and then has a user side. It uses the whole plugin theme kind of software architecture that WordPress and any modern web app typically uses this uses the same sort of paradigms for software architecture that Omeka uses. So again, you would have an administrator, user roles. Again, with more modern repository software, this is all going to be what is called a web app. So everything is done through the browser. If you're using Mozilla, the entire application is used through Mozilla. If you're using IE, Chrome, whatever your favorite browser, that's how you use the application, and thus it's called a web application. Whereas older software, Luna to a certain degree, and then they finally changed, and ContentDM is still this way, where they have what are called clients that are used, and so that's used on the client computer, which is whatever the computer you're using is a client, and then there's the host, which is where the actual software itself is installed, but the clients are sort of like little mini applications that have to be actually installed locally on your computer in order for you to use these various aspects of the software. So there's typically like an administrator clients that you would use. So and each one of those clients would have various roles that you could set. So you might have a user role, cataloger, administrator, student assistant. But I don't have these listed here, but each client, so again for like ContentDM, you might have like a cataloger client, you might have a uploader client, there might be like an administrator client for setting privileges and so forth. So again, an older type of application development, no longer do they do that anymore. If you're building a brand new piece of software, you would never build clients anymore. You'd always build it as like a web application. Other little things I've already talked about before, but can the application be integrated with the directory service that you use? So if this is like a small student project that you all are going to be doing, you don't really need to worry about that. But if you're working, say, at a library, and you have a directory service, so what a directory service is like when you go to log into your computer, log into your email, do you have single sign-on? So that means, do you have, like mine is MWolf, it's just MWOLFE, that's my net ID, and I use that ID for everything that I use on campus, for Blackboard, for Luna when I log into that, for my email, so on and so forth. When I report my days off, I use that. That would be a directory service. And the one we use here at SUNY is we use Active Directory. That's a Windows, I think that's a Windows product, but there's other ones. There's ones called LDAP, which is like a Linux type directory service. There's Shibboleth. There's all sorts of them, but that's something to consider when you're buying repository software, because not only would your digital librarians be, or librarians be needing to log into it, but you may have users. So your whole user base may need to log in if they want to download stuff, so on and so forth. As the general public, does it allow for guest logins? That's another thing to consider. So that's another thing. It gets a little bit technical and kind of dry, but it's just one of those features that actually there's a lot of work that goes into developing that feature in a piece of digital library software, and so it's something to look for if you're if that's something you need. File types and assets. Again, we talked about the types of file types you have dictating the software you use. So what kind of files can you upload in the system, and what do they look like? Because most systems, you can upload virtually anything. Sometimes they'll have, some file type parameters that are set that won't allow you to upload things, or if you do a certain file type, file format, they expect it to be spelled a certain way. So does it handle audio? Well, maybe you can upload it in there, but the look and feel is just awful. Like, all you do is basically just download the MP3, so it's almost just kind of behaving like a file server rather than a full-fledged digital library. So maybe that's good enough. Maybe it's not. Something to consider. Same way with newspapers and books. To look at newspapers and books natively in the software, or to be able to have it be integrated right in the digital library website, that requires a lot of work on the software for that. There's not a whole lot of vendors out there for that, and it's pretty tough to implement. So a lot of times, unless they're kind of known for that, you're just downloading a PDF and you're looking at it on your desktop. Same way with video. Videos, again, pretty complicated to implement. Sometimes you can upload it on YouTube and then somehow link it through your digital library. They might have their own video player that often I'll call it, like, it, when I'll explain it to people, like I'll say it has a YouTube-like environment. So YouTube has sort of become the the video, I guess the video standard today of, like, in terms of usability and what most people use. YouTube look to it. So but there are other video players out there that work with various digital library software, and so that's something to consider. Images is kind of the low-hanging fruit, I think, of digital libraries. I feel like almost all digital libraries to one degree or another can handle images. Some of them do it better than others, as I mentioned. And then what kind of file formats? I have file types, but I think of these as format types, and then these are file formats. So does it handle TIFF? Does it handle movie files? Does it handle WAV files, JPEG, 2000, regular JPEG, so on and so forth, PDF? How does it handle those? And some of them, they only want a certain type of file put in it. If you're uploading videos, as it is with Luna, I actually have to turn it into a .flv file, which is a Flash or Adobe Flash file. It won't handle movie files as they are. They need to be sort of pre-rendered. Whereas if I upload into YouTube, as I do with this course, I can pretty much throw any video file format at it. As long as it's not too exotic, YouTube will take it and render it on the fly, because, again, YouTube is really, I wouldn't call it the gold standard, because I have a lot of problems with using YouTube as a digital library holder, because it brings up all sorts of questions. Again, kind of beyond the scope of this class, but, like, is YouTube always going to be free? No one really talks about that. It's free now, but is Google, Google owns YouTube. Are they actually making money? We don't really know. I mean, their stocks are, like, through the roof. They're worth a lot of money, but do we really know it's always going to be free? And say it stays free, do we know that the ads are not going to be so much of a nuisance that our users say, you know what, I'm not going to bother with trying to watch videos in this digital library, because every time I go to look at one, I have to look at a 5-minute ad, and it's just not worth it. So it's a big debate. We do use it here in the archive some, but really ideally what you would want to use is some kind of video player that's either open source or something that you've paid to use, and you control. If you want advertisements on it, you get to control what goes up on there, and so there's not ads for sneakers and deodorant and so forth when you're looking at your important content. Some other questions to ask is, what are the institution's long-term commitment to the digital library? Is this like just a one-off thing where the president? So, and I'll tell you a little history about Luna. Luna was sort of basically a project that was funded by the president's office. This is back in like 2006 or so, and it was kind of one-off funding. They basically gave us enough money to last for 5 years, to get the license and get support for 5 years, including server support and so forth. And then after that, it's kind of what we would call like an orphan orphan application. So that means not really owned by anyone. Whereas Blackboard, as we're using for this course, there's very clear ownership there. ITS owns it. It's expected that they pay for it. I mean, all the money comes from Andrew Cuomo at the end of the day, but they own it. They have people who are assigned to run it, keep it up to date, do updates and so forth. Whereas Luna, now it's not like a child on the street. It's not quite that orphan, but it is somewhat an orphan application in that there's a lot of stakeholders in it, but there is really no one person that pays the bill. That sort of each year we kind of decide who's going to pay it, and it's been a very friendly situation so far. But it's just something to consider. So what's the commitment to that digital library? Is it one-off funding, or is there been a line set up with an actual position assigned to it, and does it have its own servers and so forth? Other things is resources and staffing and technology. The place where you work, you're buying a piece of software. Do you actually have your own servers that you own, or access to ones that may not be in your building but you have out in the cloud somewhere? Do you have the staffing that could run it? Can they install it, do updates and so forth? If they can't, can they find that person? The other thing would be is, do you actually have the staffing to run it? I mean, even once it's installed and so forth, it still takes a fair amount of expertise, which you should have at the end of this course to run one. But perhaps you're an administrator. What about those day-to-day tasks that have to be done? So who's going to do that? As I mentioned before, is it grant funded, or is it actually like a line item, like in the budget, like the yearly budget wherever you work? The digital library has its own line for whatever, $50,000 a year to pay for, say, a half-time staff member and to pay the license for the software. What are the size of your collection? Are we talking about 1,000 items? Really not that big. Is it a thousands or maybe millions of objects in that collection? Those are things as well to think about. And is the software scale, like Omeka is, I would say, small to medium-sized collections. I don't think of that as being something like the Library of Congress would use to put in, like, say, millions of images or video. It's not really designed to scale. It might. I don't really know, but does the software scale? Other things to consider is that a hosted digital library. With a hosted, you can use vendors to do all sorts of things in the work we do nowadays, where in this case the vendor would host it. So all the technology, like the really kind of nitty-gritty of like server maintenance and so forth, that's pushed to the vendor, but it comes at a cost. So at times it can be great for small institutions. It can also be good for big ones. It just depends, and there's all sorts of things to consider, but we tend to think of hosted solutions as being institutions that are smaller, but that's not always the case, because I'll say here we're a medium-sized research university, and the library does all sorts of hosted solutions. The thing with hosted is there's typically monthly or yearly fees, and the costs typically go up over time, so it's sort of reliable. You can always say it's kind of like people who like to lease cars. There's a certain kind of comfort that comes with leasing that car, is like that payment's always going to be there. Typically you think of the costs, or excuse me, the performance of that setup as being better. You're not going to like have to do a update in the middle of the night, for example, or have one of the servers go on the fritz and then you need to figure out how to fix it. With a hosted digital library, they're on it, it's their software, they know how to do it, so it's typically a little maintenance free. But in how it's configured and set up for your institution, there is a lot of coordination that still needs to run. So the software may run fine, it's not breaking, but it's just not how you want it to look. It doesn't have your branding, the metadata, template's not set up how you want it, the the login is not working, whatever. So lots of coordination, and I think of that coordination as being a little trickier because, again, you're dealing with a company that could be 1,000 miles away, so everything's over the phone or email. You're setting up tickets, so it's a ticketing system where tickets are really, they set those up to really ease sort of question and answers for their user base. But as a user personally, I don't like tickets. I mean, I know why they exist, but it just basically adds one more step to getting my, sometimes my little like 30-second question I have to ask, and really it's a 2-second answer. Typically with a hosted DL, it's kind of a one-size-fits-all, kind of plain vanilla, so typically you can't customize it as much as you might like. Sometimes the downtime can be untimely. Usually it's not a problem, but the main point I put that bullet in is that you're kind of like on their schedule, so if they need to do an update, they're going to do it when it fits not only their schedule, but their main user base. So if their user base is in England and they only have like 10 users in the U.S., they're more likely to go by British time, like when's a low peak time for them, off peak, and that off peak time may be peak time here in the U.S. So a locally installed digital library or locally administered has all sorts of pluses and minuses as well. Requires a robust technology environment, so that means that you have some kind of server room where you can have servers, web server, all sorts of infrastructure there. You usually need to have one dedicated web server, although you could have a virtualized environment, which I'm not going to talk about. I'm not going to get too much into technology in this class in terms of like networking and systems administrators and database administrators, but typically you're going to need at least one person that knows a little bit about all that stuff to be able to install it properly. Some of the good things, it allows for most customization, so if you've got really specific branding needs, you can usually do it much better with something that's locally installed, look and feel. You can integrate it with your other systems. Usually less of a yearly expense, so the price, because you're not really paying for a license typically, or if you are paying for a license, it's going to be a lot less than if they're hosting it. Server space, or excuse me, memory space and server space is going to be a lot cheaper. So say you have a lot of video files. Typically with a hosted situation, you're going to you might have to pay. There might be a file size limit, so videos tend to be big. They can be 200 megabytes all the way up to 12 gigabytes per hour, just depending on how much it's compressed. Well, if you're dealing with, say, your hosted environment, it's at like Amazon Web Services. They may have a cost for anything over 200 megabytes file size. They may charge, I don't know, $1 per megabyte. Who knows? I don't know all the expenses, but they tend to kind of spiral out of control in some ways with a hosted environment. Whereas locally, the expense is, well, you buy a server and it comes with a terabyte of storage on it, and it's relatively cheap. It costs money and there's some upfront cost to it, but it might cost you $1,000, say $5,000 for that. You can also hire technology consultants to come in and install the software for you, so you have all the technology, but you may not have the specific expertise you need to install that particular piece of software. Say it's software that needs to go in a Linux environment, and all your staff are all like Windows experts, and they're just like, you know what, I don't touch Linux boxes. So you have a consultant come in, and they get it up and operational, and it's good enough where your Windows experts can handle it and maintain it from there on. So same way with upgrades. If you have a big upgrade, you can always bring in a consultant to do it. But those are all the things you really need to think about with a locally administered digital library, whereas a hosted one, that's all taken care of for you. You just pay the bill. As long as you pay the bill, they'll keep your material up and going, and any upgrades that come along, they'll take care of that. The other option, we talked a little bit about this, I think, kind of in the beginning of the class, is a consortial approach to digital libraries. So New York Heritage, this is the one I'm probably most familiar with, like, intimately, because that's run by all the 3 Rs in the New York State regions. So the 3 Rs are the regional councils, and they have traditionally done all sorts of library services, anything from coming in and cataloging books in a library that does not have a cataloger, providing that service for a fee or sometimes for free if you're members of that 3R. Our local 3R is CDLC here in Albany. But what New York Heritage has done is they used to be all sort of separate digital libraries. They were using Content DM. That's a typical thing, typical software you'll see used in these consortiums. Now they went to one big consortium, and so your local 3R would help you get your content up. So say, for example, here, UAlbany, I have some images I want to share with them. I can upload those, and then in this consortia, they're living with all the other institutions that are using that digital library. So when you go to the New York Heritage, you may see 50, 80, maybe over 100 institutions represented in there. I don't know them all, but it might be anything from like the Tennis Hall of Fame to College of St. Rose, University at Albany, Canisius College in Buffalo might be in there, New York, Niagara College. And then again, you go from the small little guys all the way up to the big guys. Cornell, Columbia, so forth could be in there. Lots of advantages of being in there. You get technical help from the consortium itself. They have a big interest in making sure the project succeeds, so they typically want to help you as much as possible, especially if you're sort of a little institution with, again, lacking resources and staffing. They will try to fill that gap for you. Not a lot of customization options, so again, it's a consortia. It's sort of, you're trying to fit the theme of the consortia. New York Heritage, the theme of that is that it's everything in New York State. So it's nice that your material somehow, to one degree or another, sort of fit that aim of New York State history. I don't know, in this case, they might actually let, if you had a huge collection of photographs that documented the building of the Hoover Dam, I don't know, maybe you could put them in there, but they might have sort of restrictions on that. Your collections get more exposure, but at the same time you're in there with a lot of other competing collections, so there may be a lot more users that go to use New York Heritage, so that's good. There's a chance they might find, for example, UAlbany material, but I'm also competing with a lot of other colleges, for example, that maybe someone wants a picture of a commencement, and they don't care which commencement. Well, there's maybe like, a 5% chance they might get a commencement from UAlbany. Who knows? But they serve all sorts of roles. They're good. They also have their drawbacks. I tend to think, in our case, we put our material in there as sort of a shotgun approach. We want to get as much exposure as possible, so we may not put our entire digital library in there and replicate it, but we'll put a fair amount of it, some of it in there just to get some exposure. And here's some other ones. This California Digital Library is really, really beautiful. I think the New York Heritage can probably aspires to be that. I mean, again, California Digital Library, I think, is much more, how do I want to say it, much more centralized control, whereas 3Rs is a little bit more distributed. And I think there's a lot more funding there. They have a lot bigger staff and more money. And here's some other ones that you could look at if you like. You can just type them into Google and go check them out. So open source versus proprietary. We don't talk about that too much in this class, but basically open source refers to the source being the source code, the actual programming language code that is used to build the software. And the idea is that open source meant that it was open to human inspection, so you could go in and actually look at the source code, not the binary code, because typically if you're dealing with a proprietary code, you're never going to get to be able to see it. It's only going to be the machine readable code or the computer code. So a binary versus the software, the name is slipping my mind right now. Basically, they just call it the source code versus the binary code. Binary code, you're never going to see that unless you're a hacker and you crack into it and you're essentially breaking the law, just let you know. Versus open source, where the person says, yeah, here, you take the source code and do whatever you want with it. So that's two themes, and there's pluses and minuses to both sides. I guess if I were to make my views out there, I tend to be more open source, but I understand why proprietary is needed. People want to make money off their software, and if you just give it away, how do you make money off that? There are ways to do it, but that's always a question you need to ask, and perhaps before you criticize, those are both considerations, but both have their role. Both can be relatively cheap to install and use and to adopt, and both can be kind of expensive. It just depends on what your institution needs and what your resources are and kind of how you view the problem. Advantages to open source, again, you're freely able to modify it as long as you know how to program a little bit. You can do stuff to it. You can a lot of times redistribute the modifications. You can say, take your version of DSpace and put it up on the web, and your version of DSpace, if you download it, comes already like optimized in a certain way. And that's what they've done in the Linux community. There's so many different versions of Linux out there that I can't even count them on my hands. And they do. There's, you know, Ubuntu is the big one that you hear about, but there's Red Hat. There's one called Fedora. There's one Debian. There's all sorts of them, and each one of those come optimized to do one thing or another. So, but in that community, the Linux community, that's an open source operating system that you're allowed to basically do whatever you want to it and redistribute it. Typically, in open source community, there's excellent support networks, but you know, it assumes a certain amount of initiative on your part to figure out like how you get support for them. Typically, open source people are very enthusiastic, and it's a very large community. They can be so enthusiastic to being almost dogmatic about it. Disadvantages, sometimes there's no accountability. Again, I wouldn't call it orphan, but if it's open source and no one's really owning it and making money off it, who really takes the accountability for it? So if it's a big community, that's great. It's kind of like you know, very utopian, but when things start to go south with that code base, who's going to be accountable for keeping it alive, and so on and so forth? And that's where sometimes the proprietary sort of profit-based software can be a good thing. Again, it's informal, a lot of times very unaccountable sort of support channels, like, you know, who is the official owner of the software. It's sometimes there is an official owner and sometimes there's not. Types of open source I just mentioned. There's operating systems that are open source, Linux, Unix being the big one. Server software, there's all sorts of like behind the scenes kind of what you would call like infrastructural software. So Apache is a classic open source one. Tomcat that runs Java is a open source one. There's actually programming languages, again, some that are open source and some that are not. PHP is an open source one, Perl, Ruby, there's all sorts of them, but there's ones that are owned by Windows, for example, that is not open source. You're not allowed to really change, you know, take that language and do whatever you want with it. Building blocks of what I consider digital library building blocks. We have ImageMagick, which you all got to look at. libxslt, that's for doing XML. Saxon, another XML helper sort of building block, open source software. Blacklight's a big one, which I'd love to talk about in this class, but we can't. But that's basically like a front-end user interface for images for using digital libraries. Solr is a indexing software. Those are all open source. Here we have proprietary or free fee-based digital libraries. Again, we've talked about Content DM, Luna Insight, Digital Commons. This is an IR, you know, for-profit company IR. There's PastPerfect, Digitool. Those are all proprietary. They cost money. They're trying to make money off their software. Very much command and control. And if their software have problems, they always take responsibility for it. But you could never take really the take the problem into your own hands and start playing around with the source code. You typically can't do that too much, and there's many of them out there. Open source digital libraries, Fedora Commons, not to be confused with Fedora, the Linux operating system, which I just talked about. Really poorly named, but Fedora Commons, which is a open source digital library backend, was developed almost the exact same time as Fedora, the Linux distribution software. So Fedora Commons was developed at Cornell, and it's still open source and free. You can do whatever you want with it, but it has no front end to it. So what they built as front ends, there's two of them out there. There may be more, but the two big ones, there's one that's Hydra, which is basically a Ruby on Rails piece of software that runs as a front end to it, so it allows you to like actually have a graphical user interface and front end to the digital library. And then Islandora, which uses Drupal, which is a PHP-based content management system. I just mentioned Drupal earlier in this presentation, but anyways, that's used very big. Those typically are a lot of customization. You can do almost anything you want with them, But what comes with all that flexibility is typically more staffing costs and expertise to run these. DSpace is, again, we already talked about it, what I think of as like a turnkey open source, but it's a turnkey install. It sort of comes like sort of preset. You can change a lot of stuff in it, but it's pretty much set. ePrints is I think they're a British company. They're an IR software. Greenstone's a digital library software. I think they're based in Australia. And then Omeka that we're going to talk about for the rest of the course. So turnkey, when we talk about like DSpace, for example, typically you can get it up and running quickly. They tend to go with UIs that are very tried and true. The only thing with things that are sort of tried and true is they tend to not change them too much because they don't want to invest in that, and it costs and so forth. So those UIs can become kind of outdated over time. With a turnkey, typically you need less expertise and money to install them. May not look and feel the same as the rest of the website. So again, that UI is like, it looks great, but it might not match up with the rest of your website. Tend to go with the lowest common denominator or whatever their user base is. So they're not going to optimize their turnkey application for like that one user in a sea of 1,000 users who wants some bizarre feature on their set. They're not going to entertain that. But those ones that are the lowest common denominator, they're going to definitely meet those and then some. Again, the turnkey, I'm kind of lumping open source and proprietary in there, but you can't customize it too much, typically, especially if it's proprietary. Again, turnkey, by making it so easy to install, it's very tough to experiment with it. And there can be a high dissatisfaction over time. Again, if you can't customize it to your needs, over time you're like, oh, I wish it would do this, or I wish it would do that. And those things it does well, you tend to stop appreciating over time, and you always want that next thing. So customize, more likely to meet you and your users' needs. It's what most institutions want. They're like, I want that, when they see that customized install, because it really is, it looks gorgeous if it's done right, because it's designed specifically to whatever that institution wants, so it tends to be optimized the best. But not always practical. The upfront investment in time can be pretty costly, both in research time, development time, figure out what you want. And then that technology aspect of it, is typically the most costly. Customized settings also entail a lot of things. That means that every time you do an upgrade, you need to make sure that those customized settings don't break. So like if you've got certain configuration files, or you've got images that you've changed to meet your own like branding thing, and then when you do an upgrade it sort of sticks in its sort of like generic image, you got to make sure that all those directory paths and everything are set right. So anyways, customize is something that we all want, and we kind of dream for it. I think almost every person would say they want something that's the most optimized, but it always has to be weighed with the practicalities of your situation and your institution's sort of needs, but also what their resources are.